Deshaun Mercer was 37 years old when the eviction notice he had signed as the managing member of Eastgate Property Holdings, LLC, was delivered to apartment 4C at the Glenwood Arms in Memphis, Tennessee. The apartment his ex-wife Brianna had moved into 8 months earlier with a man named Craig Whitfield, a sales manager at a medical device company who drove a new Dodge Charger and had, according to the 3 people who had mentioned him to Deshaun without being asked, a way of speaking about his own financial situation that suggested he believed the size of a man's presentation was the same thing as the size of a man. Deshaun had not signed the eviction notice because of Brianna. He had signed it because Craig Whitfield had not paid rent in 61 days, had ignored 2 written notices, and had left a maintenance request on the property management system at 11:30 at night that included language that Deshaun's property manager Rhonda had described in a text message as something I would rather not repeat. The eviction was correct procedure. Nothing more. What made it something else was what Craig Whitfield saw when he opened the certified envelope and unfolded the notice and read to the bottom of the page where the managing member's name and signature appeared in the space reserved for them. Deshaun A. Mercer. Craig had not known that Deshaun owned the building. Brianna had not known that Deshaun owned the building. Nobody in their circle had known because Deshaun had purchased it through the LC 4 years ago and had never had a reason to mention it, and had, in fact, made a practice of not mentioning it. Because his grandmother Willa had told him when he was 17 years old that the men who talked the loudest about what they had were almost always the men who had the least, and that the men who said nothing were usually the ones you needed to study closely. He had studied that observation closely for 20 years. It had served him without exception. What happened next would cost Craig Whitfield his apartment, his composure, and whatever version of the story he had been telling himself about the man he had replaced. Before we jump into the story, comment where in the world you are watching from and subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you need to hear. The morning the process server delivered the notice, Deshaun was at a job site in Midtown Memphis reviewing the foundation work on a commercial renovation he was managing for a retail client who needed the space ready in 11 weeks and who had the specific anxiety of people who had never managed construction before and were measuring their anxiety against the calendar rather than against the work itself. Deshaun was a general contractor. He had been one for 14 years, since the summer after his father Raymond passed, and Raymond's small renovation company had either folded or continued, and Deshaun at 23 had decided, without much deliberation and with the specific resolve of a man who has been handed something and understands that the handing is itself a form of trust, that it was going to continue. He had taken the company's 3 remaining clients and its 1 employee and its tools and its name, and had rebuilt it from that foundation over the course of a decade into something that employed 11 people and had completed projects in 7 counties across the Mid-South. He had learned the construction business from Raymond, who had learned it from his own father, and the thing you inherited from that lineage, beyond the specific technical knowledge of how things were built, was the understanding that a structure's integrity was established in the work that nobody saw. The footings, the framing, the rough electrical, everything that would be enclosed and invisible once the building was finished and occupied. Raymond had told him, on a job site in Germantown when Deshaun was 16, nobody pays attention to what's inside the walls. That is exactly why you pay attention to what's inside the walls. You build for the person who will live inside the thing you make, not for the person walking past it. This had struck Deshaun as true about construction. He had eventually come to understand that it was true about most other things as well. The Glenwood Arms had come to him not through ambition, but through arithmetic. In 2019, one of his longtime subcontractors had mentioned that a 12-unit apartment building in the Orange Mound neighborhood was going to auction. The owner had died without a will. The estate was tangled. The property had been deferred maintained for 3 years and was sitting at a price that reflected its condition rather than its potential. Deshawn had driven by, walked the perimeter, pressed his palm against the exterior walls the way his father had taught him to feel for moisture intrusion, and understood within 45 minutes that the building was sound where it counted and distressed where it didn't. He had purchased it at auction for $218,000 through the LLC, which his accountant Bernard had suggested forming 2 years earlier for exactly this kind of opportunity. He had spent 11 months and $64,000 of his own labor and materials, bringing it up to code, and then above code, and then into the condition he would have wanted if he were the person living inside it, rather than the person who owned it. The renovation had increased the assessed value to $490,000, and it produced a building whose 12 units were fully occupied, and whose tenants, in Deshawn's experience, tended to stay, because the maintenance was responsive, and the management was fair. He had not sought out Craig Whitfield as a tenant. Craig had applied through the standard listing Rhonda managed, had passed the credit and background screening, had paid the first month and deposit without issue. That had been 8 months ago. That Craig was Brianna's new partner was something Deshawn had learned from his sister Kezia 3 months after Craig moved in, at a Sunday dinner that Willa still hosted at the house on Lamar Avenue, as she had hosted Sunday dinners for 40 years, without fail. Because the gathering of family around a table was in Willa's theology a sacrament that required no particular occasion and no excuse. Kezia had mentioned it without drama, the way family mentions things that are simply facts, and Deshawn had registered it the way he registered any data point that was not yet actionable, and had gone back to his cornbread and said, "Is that right?" He had met Brianna in 2016 through a mutual friend at a gathering in Cooper Young, and she had been genuinely good company in the early years, organized, socially easy, with opinions about things that she stated directly, and without the kind of performance that made directness feel like a claim to attention rather than a form of respect. He had liked the directness. He had liked that she asked him real questions about the renovation work, and had listened to the answers with what appeared to be genuine interest. He had been careful with her in the way he was careful with any structure worth investing in, attentive to the foundation, patient about the surface, willing to do the work before declaring the result. They had been married for 3 years. What changed was not something he could name precisely. It was the kind of change that a building reveals before it announces. A subtle shift in load distribution. A micro crack in a place you only find if you are pressing your palm flat against the wall, the way his father had taught him. Brianna had developed a restlessness in the second year that he had attributed, initially to the legitimate dissatisfactions of adult life, and then, in the 3rd year, had come to understand as something more directional than general. She was moving towards something that was not him. He had noticed this, and had filed it, and had waited for the information to clarify, and it had clarified, in the specific and conclusive way that information eventually does when you are patient enough to wait for the full picture. He had not been in love with Brianna at the end. He had been, in the final year of the marriage, in a state of accurate observation about what the marriage was and what it was not. Not a failure of love exactly, but a failure of alignment. The way 2 load-bearing elements that were both structurally sound could still fail to distribute weight correctly if they had been positioned wrong from the beginning. He did not hold this against her. He did not hold much of anything against her. He had been 34 years old when they signed the divorce papers, and he had been, by that point, sufficiently clear about his own life and his own work and his own direction that the ending of the marriage had not altered those things. He had rebuilt from the conclusion the way he had rebuilt from other conclusions, methodically, without drama, with the understanding that the structure you are building toward is more relevant than the one you are leaving behind. What had produced the eviction was neither complicated nor personal. Craig Whitfield had paid his rent on time for the first 4 months. In month 5, he had paid late, with a message to Rhonda that suggested the lateness was temporary. In month 6, he had paid partial. In month 7, he had paid nothing, and had not responded to Rhonda's first written notice. In month 8, he had paid nothing, and had responded to Rhonda's second written notice with the message she had declined to repeat. Deshawn had reviewed the file on a Thursday morning, confirmed that every procedural step had been followed correctly, and had authorized the eviction filing. He had signed the notice as managing member of Eastgate Property Holdings, LLC, without any particular reflection on who lived in apartment 4C. The procedure was the procedure. The signature was the signature. He had found out about Craig's reaction from Rhonda, who had learned about it from the building's first-floor tenant, a retired teacher named Mrs. Caldwell, who had a quality of observational awareness that made her the most reliably accurate source of information about building dynamics that Rhonda possessed. Mrs. Caldwell had reported that on the evening the notice was delivered, there had been an extended and audible conversation in apartment 4C, the content of which she had not been able to hear clearly, but the emotional register of which had been unmistakable. Rhonda had sent Deshawn a text that said, "You might want to know that 4C found out who you are." He had read the text. He had sent back a thumbs up. Then he had gone back to the foundation review. He had not told Willa about Craig Whitfield moving into the building. He had not told her because it had not seemed relevant at the time, and because Willa, who had seen most things in her 79 years and had opinions about all of them, had a way of responding to coincidences that occasionally made them larger than they needed to be. Which was not a criticism of Willa, but a recognition that some situations were better managed quietly, and then reported after the fact. He had told her on the following Sunday dinner, when the eviction was already filed and the outcome was already a matter of procedure. Willa had listened to the full account. She had been quiet for a moment. Then she had said, "Your grandfather always said that a man who makes a scene in someone else's house eventually discovers it isn't his house to make scenes in." She had said this with the measured satisfaction of a woman who had lived long enough to see a sufficient number of observations confirmed by events. Then she had passed Deshawn the sweet potatoes and moved on to other subjects, because Willa did not dwell on things that had already resolved themselves correctly. The formal response to the eviction came not from Craig directly, but from Craig's attorney, a letter that arrived at Rhonda's office email 8 days after the notice was served, and that argued, on procedural grounds, that the notice had been improperly served, and that the LLC's standing to file was defective because of a technical irregularity in the registered agent documentation that Craig's attorney had identified by searching the Tennessee Secretary of State's records. The argument was specific, and, if the facts had supported it, would have been legitimate. They did not support it. Deshawn had forwarded the letter to his own attorney, a man named Franklin Osai, who had reviewed it and had called Deshawn within an hour and said, "The registered agent issue was corrected 14 months ago." The filing in the Secretary of State database was updated the same day. This is either a research error or a delay tactic. Either way, it does not affect the proceeding. He had filed the response the same afternoon. The court had reviewed both filings and had set a hearing date. Franklin Osai was 52 years old and practiced property and civil litigation from an office in Midtown Memphis with the organized precision of a man who had seen landlord-tenant disputes from every conceivable angle and who had developed, through that exposure, a near-perfect ability to identify which disputes were genuine legal contests and which were performances. This one, he had told Deshawn, was the second kind. He had prepared for the hearing with the same thoroughness he brought to matters far more complex, Because thoroughness was not something he varied by the size of the stage, a principle Deshawn recognized immediately, because it was the same principle he applied to renovation work, where the job nobody was watching required the same standard as the one everybody was photographing. At the hearing, which lasted 47 minutes, Franklin presented the complete eviction file. Every notice, every payment record, every communication between Rhonda's management office and Apartment 4C. The corrected Secretary of State registration with its timestamp, and a declaration from Rhonda confirming that every procedural step had been followed correctly and in the correct sequence. Craig Whitfield's attorney argued the procedural objection. The judge reviewed the registration filing date. The judge noted that the correction predated the tenancy by 14 months. The judge noted that the payment record was complete and unambiguous. The judge ruled in favor of Eastgate Property Holdings, LLC. Craig Whitfield had 30 days to vacate. The ruling was entered at 11:43 in the morning on a Tuesday. Craig Whitfield had 30 days to vacate. On the day of the hearing, Deshawn had been at a different job site, a residential renovation in Cordova that was in the finished carpentry stage, and required his attention because the homeowner had specific and considered ideas about the built-in shelving in the study, and Deshawn had specific and considered ideas about how to execute them, and the two sets of ideas were close but not identical, and required the kind of direct conversation that produced the correct result. He had received a text from Franklin at 11:47 that said, "Ruled in our favor." Judgment entered. He had sent back, "Thank you." He had gone back to the shelving conversation. It was a good conversation. The homeowner had a good eye for proportion, which was rarer than people understood. He did not think of Craig Whitfield as an adversary. He did not think of him much at all, which was the most accurate reflection of how relevant Craig Whitfield was to Deshawn's life. He was a tenant who had not paid rent and had been rude to the property manager and had been evicted on correct procedure. That was the complete description of the situation, and Deshawn had neither the interest nor the inclination to extend it. The eviction had not been about Brianna, and it had not been about Craig's relationship to Brianna, and it had not been a statement or a signal or a message of any kind. It had been a property management decision made on documented grounds by a managing member who had signed his name on a notice, because the notice was legally required and factually correct. The fact that Craig Whitfield had chosen to make it into something larger than it was had been Craig Whitfield's problem and had remained his problem throughout. Deshawn had noticed this and had found it, in the way he found most things that confirmed what he had already understood about how the world worked. Completely unsurprising. Brianna he thought of with something closer to neutrality, the kind that arrives not from indifference but from genuine resolution, when you have processed a thing completely enough that it no longer generates heat in either direction. He wished her no harm. He did not wish her anything in particular. She was a person he had been married to and was no longer married to, and the shape of their lives had separated with the clean finality of two structures that had been correctly deconstructed, the materials sorted, and the site cleared, ready for whatever came next. What came next, for Deshawn, was the continuation of the things he had been building before the marriage, and had been building during it, and had continued building after it, which was the truest possible evidence that the work was the work, and had nothing to do with whoever was or wasn't in the room while he was doing it. 9 months after the hearing, Deshawn was standing in front of the Glenwood Arms on a Saturday morning in April, reviewing the exterior with Rhonda, who had a checklist and the specific organized energy of a woman who managed 12 units and took the management seriously, because she understood that management was a form of respect for the people who lived inside the building and for the building itself. Rhonda had been Deshawn's property manager for 6 years and had a working knowledge of every unit's history, what had been repaired, what had been upgraded, which tenants were long-term and which were new, and where the gaps were between what the building presented and what it actually required. Deshawn trusted her judgment the way he trusted the judgment of anyone who had demonstrated over time that they looked carefully and reported accurately. The building was in good condition. The spring light made the brick look warm, which it was. Deshawn had repointed the mortar on the south face the previous fall and had repainted the window trim in a color he had considered for 3 months, because color on brick was a decision that aged with the building and therefore deserved the patience the building had earned. He had also replaced the lobby lighting with fixtures that were efficient and appropriately scaled for the space, which was a detail so small it was invisible to anyone who had not noticed the previous fixtures, and which was precisely the kind of detail Deshawn attended to, because his father had taught him that invisible improvements were the most important kind. The 12 units were full. The operating income for the property was running 11% above projection for the year, which Bernard had noted in the last quarterly summary, with a muted approval of a man who regards correct outcomes as evidence of correct process rather than occasions for enthusiasm. Mrs. Caldwell had renewed her lease for a 3rd consecutive year. Apartment 4C had a new tenant, a young woman named Jasmine, who worked as a respiratory therapist at a hospital nearby, and who had asked, at her move and walkthrough, very specific questions about the ventilation system, which Deshawn had appreciated because it demonstrated that she understood the difference between the surface of a place and the mechanics of it. He had purchased a second property in the preceding 8 months, a 6-unit building in the South Memphis neighborhood that had the same profile the Glenwood Arms had presented in 2019, sound bones, deferred surface, priced for its condition rather than its potential. Bernard, his accountant, had reviewed the acquisition and had said, "You have a pattern." Deshawn had said, "It is a good pattern." Bernard had agreed. He had begun the renovation work the previous month, on weekends, doing the rough work himself before bringing in the crew, because doing the rough work himself was how he understood the building, and understanding the building was the only way he trusted himself to make good decisions about it. His father, Raymond, had taught him this. He had not forgotten it. His personal life had reordered itself with the quiet naturalness of a room that has been cleared of furniture it had outgrown and refurnished with things that fit correctly. His friend Marcus, who had known Deshawn since high school and who had a quality of social discernment that Deshawn trusted entirely, had introduced him 6 months ago to a woman named Paulette Garrison, who was a structural engineer at a firm in downtown Memphis, and who had, the first time she walked through the Glenwood Arms with Deshawn on a tour he had offered because she had asked thoughtful questions about the renovation, correctly identified 2 places where the original contractor had deviated from what the drawings would have required, which Deshawn had already known about and had addressed but had not mentioned, because he had wanted to see what she noticed. She had noticed exactly the right things. He had found this, as he found most things that were accurate and precise, genuinely attractive. She was not with him this Saturday morning. She was running, which she did on Saturday mornings as a matter of personal discipline that Deshawn respected without sharing, because his own mornings were better served by the specific stillness of standing in front of a building and understanding it. They had plans for the afternoon. That was sufficient. Willa had met Paulette at the previous Sunday dinner and had served her the sweet potatoes without comment, which was Willa's way of indicating approval. She had told Deshawn afterward, in the kitchen while he was helping with the dishes, "She asks real questions." Deshawn had said, "Yes." Willa had handed him a dish towel. She had not said anything else, because she did not need to. Deshawn set Rhonda's checklist back on the clipboard and looked at the building. The brick was warm in the morning light. The window trim was the right color. The sign above the entrance, modest and properly maintained, said Glenwood Arms in the same letters it had said for 40 years. which was one of the things Deshaun had decided to keep when he renovated, because some things that have been in a place long enough have earned the right to remain. He had built the inside correctly and left the outside what it had always been, and the building held both of these things without contradiction, which was the most a building could do, and was, in Deshaun's experience, enough. He folded the checklist. He gave it back to Rhonda. He looked once more at the south face, where the mortar was fresh and correct, and invisible in the way that correct work is invisible, present, functional, doing exactly what it was built to do, without requiring attention or acknowledgement. That was the only kind of work worth doing. He had known this since he was 16 on a job site with his father, and he had never found a reason to revise it. I hope you enjoyed that one. Be sure to like the video and subscribe so you don't miss the next story. I've picked out 2 more for you that I think you'll really like.